When the storms of the world come crashing upon you, when the waves rise higher than your courage, most people step back, afraid they might drown. But India chose a different path. It did not let the noise of doubt become the soundtrack of its journey. It stood tall, not because it was certain of the outcome, but because it was certain of its purpose. And that is what makes all the difference between those who watch history happen and those who make history. There was a time when the very thought of defying the so-called global order was seen as impossible, even foolish. There were warnings, there were threats, there were whispers that India would lose more than it could gain. But strength is not measured by how many people agree with you. It is measured by how many storms you can walk through without bending your back. India chose to stand when every sign said, "Sit down," and in that moment, it transformed from a participant in history to an author of it. Standing tall is not a matter of posture, it is a matter of principle. When you choose not to bow down, you invite criticism, you invite isolation, you even invite risk. But you also invite respect, the kind that cannot be bought or begged for. India understood that dignity is not a gift from the powerful, it is the reward of those who refuse to trade their soul for short-term comfort. The world watched with curiosity at first, then with disbelief, and finally with admiration. Because the thing about strength is that it is contagious. When one nation stands firm, it silently gives permission for others to do the same. America may have had the spotlight, the resources, the alliances, but in that defining moment, it could only watch as India took the stage. This was not arrogance, it was clarity. Clarity that the tides will always rise, but those who anchor themselves in conviction will never be swept away. India's journey shows us that true power lies not in avoiding the storm, but in becoming the lighthouse that stands unmoved while others seek shelter. And once you have stood tall through the fiercest winds, the world can never look at you the same way again. In the end, it was not just a decision, not just a political move. It was a declaration of identity, a reminder that a nation's worth is not defined by the approval of the strong, but by the courage of its own convictions. India stood tall against the tide, and in doing so, it changed the direction of history itself. For years, the narrative was the same, that India's progress depended on the goodwill of others, that its growth was tied to the strings of global powers, and that without those strings, the puppet would fall. But one day, India decided it was not a puppet at all. It was the puppeteer of its own destiny, and in that realization, the chains of dependency began to break, one link at a time. Dependency is comfortable because it allows you to lean on someone else's strength, but comfort is the enemy of greatness. India had been told, directly and indirectly, that it needed certain nations to hold its hand if it wanted to walk in the corridors of global power. Yet the truth is, every hand that holds you can also hold you back. And sometimes, letting go is the only way to truly move forward. The breaking of these chains was not just about trade or diplomacy. It was about dignity. It was about standing in the world and saying, we can create, we can innovate, we can decide for ourselves. And that is a terrifying sentence for those who built their influence on your dependents. Because when you stop needing them, they start fearing you. It wasn't easy. Independence never is. It comes with the weight of responsibility, the uncertainty of self-reliance, and the risk of standing alone. But what is the value of freedom if it's only an illusion? India understood that a future dictated by others is not a future worth having. It took the risk, and in doing so, proved that risk is the seed of transformation. The world's reaction was telling. Some called it bold, others reckless. But history has never remembered those who simply played it safe. History remembers the ones who dared to take the pen from someone else's hand and write their own story. India didn't just step out of someone's shadow, it built a place where no shadow could fall. The breaking of these chains sent a ripple far beyond its borders. It whispered to other nations, "You do not have to accept the script you were handed, you can create your own." And that whisper became a roar. America, the great influencer, could do nothing but watch as the dependency it once cultivated turned into a legacy of defiance. In that moment, India's freedom was no longer symbolic. It was practical, visible, undeniable. The world saw not a country turning away from someone, but a country turning towards itself. And when a nation learns to trust its own strength more than anyone else's, there is no chain in the world strong enough to bind it again. Every great nation has its trials, moments when the world seems to conspire against it, when the weight of challenges feels heavier than the strength to endure. For India, those moments came not once, but many times. There were sanctions meant to weaken its resolve, criticism meant to sow doubt, and predictions of failure meant to cripple its confidence. Yet, instead of letting these adversities break it, India transformed them into the very force that propelled it forward. Adversity is a strange teacher. It doesn't offer comfort, it strips you of it. It doesn't give you shortcuts, it forces you to climb. And in that climb, you discover muscles you never knew existed, muscles of resilience, ingenuity, and faith. India's path was forged in fire. Each obstacle became an opportunity to innovate. Each setback was an invitation to adapt. And with every challenge faced, the nation's spine grew straighter, its vision sharper, its determination unshakable. The world expected India to bend under pressure, to retreat into the safety of compromise. But something extraordinary happened. Instead of bending, India built. It built industries that could thrive without foreign crutches. It built alliances on mutual respect rather than dependency. It built a sense of national pride that no external power could manufacture or destroy. The criticism was constant. The doubters were loud. And yet, India chose to answer not with words, but with results. Where there was scarcity, it created abundance. Where there was dependency, it crafted self-reliance. Where there was uncertainty, it planted the seeds of long-term vision. These were not quick victories. They were victories earned through years of persistence, through sleepless nights of planning, through sacrifices that the world will never fully see. And perhaps that's the beauty of turning adversity into advantage. It's not about proving the world wrong in a moment of triumph, but about becoming so strong that the world no longer doubts your ability to survive. America, with all its influence and reach, could only watch as every challenge thrown India's way became another step toward independence and global respect. In the end, adversity did not weaken India, it refined it. Like gold tested in fire, the nation emerged purer, stronger, more valuable than before. The storms that were meant to sink it became the winds that carried it to new horizons. And in that transformation, India taught the world that the measure of a nation is not in the comfort it enjoys, but in the challenges it overcomes and the victories it carves out of the hardest battles. Sometimes the loudest statement you can make is to say nothing at all. India understood this truth in a way few nations ever do. When the moment came, it didn't need grand speeches or aggressive posturing. It didn't rush to justify its actions or seek validation from the powerful. Instead, it simply acted with precision, with purpose, and with a calm that carried more weight than any declaration could. America, used to being the voice that shaped the world's conversations found itself on the sidelines. It was not that India silenced America. It was that India's quiet confidence spoke so loudly that there was no room left for anyone else's words. In diplomacy, as in life, there is a certain kind of power that does not need to be announced. It is recognized instinctively. India's decisions that day carried that kind of power. This silence was not weakness, it was strategy. The strong do not always roar. Sometimes they whisper, and the world still listens. India's refusal to be drawn into unnecessary conflict showed that real leadership is not about dominating the conversation, but about controlling the outcome. And when you control the outcome, the conversation eventually bends in your favor anyway. Every step India took was deliberate, every move calculated. There were no theatrics, no threats, no demands for attention. The action itself was the message. We know who we are, we know what we want, and we will not be swayed. In that stillness there was steel. In that restraint there was resolve, and in that resolve there was a kind of unshakable dignity that cannot be bought or borrowed. For America, this was perhaps the most unsettling part, the realization that influence is not always exercised through noise, but often through the quiet certainty of a nation that no longer needs approval. India's silence was like a mirror, forcing others to confront their own dependence on drama and dominance. It proved that you don't have to challenge someone openly to outplay them. Sometimes you simply move past them while they are still talking. The world watched as India redefined power, not as the ability to control others, but as the freedom to control oneself. That is the kind of strength that cannot be sanctioned away, cannot be negotiated down, and cannot be ignored. And so, while America could only watch, India wrote a chapter in history that will be remembered not for its noise, but for its calm, not for its chaos, but for its clarity. There are moments in history when one nation's courage becomes the spark that lights a fire in others. India's move was one of those moments. It was more than a decision about politics or trade. It was a statement to the world. Sovereignty is not a privilege granted by the powerful. It is a right that lives within every nation willing to claim it. When India stood up, it wasn't just standing for itself. It was standing for every country that had ever been told to know its place, to play small, to stay in line. The beauty of this act was that it carried no arrogance, no desire to dominate, only the quiet confidence of a nation that knew its worth. And that confidence resonated across borders. Nations that had long accepted dependency as their fate began to question it. Leaders who had been hesitant to act began to imagine new possibilities. The world suddenly had proof that you could defy the expectations of the strong and still command respect. For decades, global power had been defined in narrow terms: military might, economic control, political alliances dictated by a few. But India's move expanded that definition. It showed that true power is the ability to make your own choices and bear the weight of those choices without fear. It reminded the world that independence is not the absence of relationships, but the presence of equality within them. America's position in this was telling. It was not that it lacked the ability to respond, but that it lacked the right response. Because when a nation stands on the foundation of self-respect, intimidation loses its effect. And so America, for all its history of shaping global outcomes, could only stand by and watch as the balance of influence subtly shifted. This was not just India's victory. It was a shared victory for every voice that had ever been silenced in the global arena. It was a reminder that unity does not require uniformity, that cooperation does not require submission. It told the world, You can walk alongside the powerful without walking behind them. And perhaps the most powerful part was the hope it ignited. Hope that the future of the world need not be written by the few at the expense of the many. Hope that even the most entrenched systems can be challenged by courage. Hope that history is not a fixed story, but a living one, waiting for bold hands to turn the page. In that single move, India became more than a nation protecting its own interests. It became a symbol, a reminder, a source of strength for those still waiting for their moment. And sometimes that is how change truly begins, not with a shout, but with a single act of courage that the world cannot ignore. History is often remembered for battles fought, treaties signed, and borders redrawn. But sometimes the most profound shifts happen without a single shot fired or a line moved on the map. India's decision was one of those moments. On the surface, nothing changed. The maps in classrooms looked the same. The flags flew where they always had. Yet beneath that familiar picture, something irreversible had taken place. The balance of power had shifted, and the story of the future would no longer be written the same way. This was not just a political step, it was an act of self-definition. For decades, the global stage had been shaped by a few dominant voices, and the rest of the world was expected to perform in harmony with them. India chose to change the script. It wasn't about rebellion for its own sake. It was about refusing to let others hold the pen to its destiny. And in that moment, a new chapter began. Every great change in history starts with a decision that seems small at first, but echoes far beyond its borders. India's choice was exactly that. It reminded the world that history is not something you inherit, it's something you create. And the act of creating, it requires courage, clarity, and the willingness to stand alone if necessary. America's role in this moment was unusual. It was not leading, not directing, not shaping, it was watching. And in that stillness, the symbolism was powerful. For so long, the idea that a nation could take a bold, independent step without American approval seemed unlikely. Yet here was India doing exactly that, and doing it with such conviction that even the most powerful could not reverse it. The ripples of this act went far beyond politics. It altered conversations in boardrooms, in parliaments, in villages. It inspired thinkers, leaders, and everyday people to reimagine what was possible. It made clear that influence is not fixed, it is fluid, and those who dare to act with integrity can redirect its flow. What happened that day was not the end of a journey, but the beginning of one. A journey toward a world where power is more evenly shared, where respect is earned not by dominance, but by principle, and where history is shaped by many hands instead of a select few. India had stepped into that world ahead of its time, and in doing so, it invited others to follow. In the years to come, people will look back and realize that the maps didn't change, but everything else did. The lines of power were redrawn in the hearts and minds of nations, and it all began because one country chose to believe that its future was its own to write, and that no one, not even the most powerful, could take the pen away